Welcome everybody to Teaching LGBT History in the California History Social Science Framework. This technically is day 2, but we'll talk more about that in just a minute. All of the information for this presentation and what we're talking about today is being recorded. Those of you who are listening to the recording, welcome. Sorry you couldn't join us in person, but we understand. Everything can be found on my website at www.robdarrow.us. If you click on presentations, you'll see the links to this presentation today. And this is brought to you today by both Monterey County Office of Education and the Santa Clara County Office of Education. So I'll let Jennifer and Laura add their greetings.
Welcome, I'm Jennifer Elliman from the Monterey County Office of Education. We're so happy to have Rob with us to guide us through this journey. And we started last summer at MCOE with an LGBTQ History and School Climate Institute that Rob facilitated. And then we focused into this 11th grade cohort that began in January and continued with another scheduled face-to-face session that was supposed to be in April that we've now converted into this webinar series that we've also opened up to others. So we're so glad everybody who's here was able to join us. And if you're not and you're watching this on webinar, thank you for taking the time to integrate LGBTQ history into the curriculum. That's what the framework calls for and the Fair Education Act calls for. And we invite you to join us for our other Region 5 History, Social Science, Community of Practice, Professional Learning and Collaboration. We have a hashtag Region 5 HSS if you're on Twitter or social media. And we have a webpage that I'll add to the chat where we have our other click resources.
Very well said, Jennifer. I mean, I think I'm Laura Guajardo from the Santa Clara County Office of Education, and we started our cohorts a little bit later in the spring. But we're excited to be working with Monterey County and bringing this to you folks virtually, and look forward to really putting in the work and creating something amazing for our students to learn and know. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And again, I just want to mention that the links are on the slides and in the chat rooms. Those of you who are watching this, you'll have the links ahead of time anyway, so you'll follow along on the agenda. So I always start with this slide to let everybody know that this is a safe space. Whether we're face-to-face or online, it's a safe space. The article that Jennifer sent out and is linked there points out that during this pandemic time, there are students who are home with families who they are not out to. And so that's a challenge for all of us. So the more we can all educate our students, the safer they feel throughout. A safe space is important for all, wherever we are. So consider this a safe space to ask and talk about whatever you'd like. If there are sensitive questions or things like that, we can pause the recording. And if you've got questions, you can type them in the chat room as well. In fact, well, most of you have been part of this already. So you know that pink triangle. Oh, I'll check with all of you. So where's that pink triangle from? Somebody type that in the chat room. And of course, you all being on computers could just Google that question. Yeah, Greg points out Nazi Germany, right? In the concentration camps, the pink triangle was what was put on inmates who were gay males. And gay males were the last group that were liberated from concentration camps. Very few people told that story because, as you can imagine, being in the concentration alone, what that was like, and then being gay in addition to that in that time period was even more challenging. But we've reclaimed it to let people know this is a safe space, and feel free to be who you are. So again, just to follow up on the review that Jennifer and Laura mentioned, we started out, we had starting of 11th grade cohorts in January and February, and we now have what we call our new pandemic plan, right? We sent a survey out to all of you to see what would work best for you. And you said to us, this time period, roughly 11:30 to 1, and doing 2 different webinars for an hour and a half is the best way. And so that's what we put together based on that. So our webinar focus today is really teaching about Stonewall and what you can take from today. What I have put together for you today, you can teach it tomorrow. You'll have all the information you need to teach it, and I hope you will teach it sometime this week or very soon, because then our hope is that a week from today that you will do something with this, something, and I'll say, you know, maybe you talk to some members of your family, maybe you share it with a staff member, maybe you actually teach a lesson with your students. I would encourage you to do something with it, to share it with somebody over this next week somehow, so that when we get together next week, you can share back what happened and how it went and that sort of thing. Now, in addition to the 2 cohorts, we also invited others to join. So for those of you who are joining and have not been part of any previous workshops, I welcome you. I'm not going to go back to do all the background information, but if you go to my website, you can go back and look at those slides. Our focus today is really about teaching Stonewall, getting a chance to do an activity related to that you can in turn do with your students, and then we're going to move forward with that. So that's the purpose. Oh, the other thing, as you all know, I had to convert these lessons to think in terms of, okay, if you don't see people face to face, how do you teach this online? Now, fortunately for me, I opened an online school about 10 years ago and kind of know how to do that because I taught lots of people how to do that. So, but most of the lessons that are out there are lessons where people are thinking about how to teach them face to face. So know that the stuff we're doing today is all organized for you so you can take it and use it as if it's a lesson online. So our outcomes for today is what's leading up to Stonewall, to learn about some different perspectives of the Stonewall riots. That date, June 28th, 1969, is an important date. I hope you remember that. And then a little bit about what happened after Stonewall. And as I mentioned, we're recording this webinar so we can share it with people later. So for today, if you don't already have a piece of paper or something to write with, I'd like to ask you to get that out. And also, obviously you're on your computer or phone or tablet at this point, so that's fine. But just get ready to write on something, because as part of this, I want you to be writing. And we already did this quick intro in our chat. People shared where they're from, and again, just for the recording, I'll mention that we've got people here from Greenfield, from Monterey, from Fremont, from San Jose, and I'm in Aptos, Santa Cruz, and great to have you all here. So on that piece of paper, this is the first thing I want you to write down. I want you to think about your lives, just your life, the years you've lived. I want you to think back and think of an important date in your life. And it could be maybe a couple dates. And if you have and then I want you to think about a place that is special or important to you, and to name that place. And as I was putting this together, I thought about this for myself, and I'd say an important date for me is December 31st, 1989, because that was the birth of my daughter. I remember that very well. I've got other important dates, but that one I thought I would share. And then I thought about a place that was special to me. I grew up in Santa Cruz and moved back to Santa Cruz. And Santa Cruz is a special place, but if I had to name a specific place in Santa Cruz, I would name Santa Cruz the downtown town clock location. Now there's other important places, but I mentioned the town clock because my dad helped put that together. And I can remember in high school, all the time he spent organizing and raising money to build that downtown town clock. So that's my important place. That's my important date. Now I want you to write down your important date and your important place. And I'll give you a minute to do that. Thanks, Sarah, for sharing that. Oh my gosh, we'll have to talk about that. Anyway, I'm going to give you a minute or two to write those thoughts down for yourselves. And then when you're comfortable, please do type those in the chat room. Somebody wrote their wedding date. San Jose State University is an important place to learn, like that. Somebody put a field outside of Canterbury, England. Oh, wow, that sounds fun. Farm on garden. Oh, I don't even think I'm going to say it right. In Maine. Gilroy High is a special place. All right. Yeah, some people's graduation dates. So Lily, the fact that you put UCR, I'm assuming that's UC Riverside. So
Yes. For my undergrad and my master's, I loved it.
Did we already have that conversation that I graduated from there too?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, people's parents passed away, engagements, yeah, births and stuff like that. Yep. So those are all important dates and times for people, and you can keep writing those in there. And then I wanted to invite you to think about important dates in history that we teach our kids in history. What are some important dates in history that we teach in our history classes? If you just type in the date and then what that event was. So yeah, so one of them, same one I thought of as Jennifer did, which is July 4, 1776. We all know that as Declaration of Independence. 9/11 is another one. Any others that are important dates that we teach our kids? Yep, December 7th, 1941. Several people put that in. A date that will live in infamy. Yeah, and Nikki put in 1619, which is a more recent year that we are aware of. So glad to see that. Oh, April 30th, 1975, the fall of Saigon. August 1963, the I Have a Dream speech. And you know, some of these dates are important to us individually in our cultures. And some of these are dates that we teach in our classes as well. Assassination dates of Lincoln and for some probably Kennedy as well. Yep, those are, and Martin Luther King. Those are important dates. People probably remember some of those if you live through them. Great. So the purpose of this was just to get you all to start thinking about why places are important, why dates are important, because that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. But I have another question for you. What would it take for you to take action against an injustice? So there have been various protests in history. Women's suffrage marches, civil rights, Vietnam, you've named some of those dates there. What would it take for you to attend a protest or march in person to stand up and against an injustice? So here are some examples of important moments in history. So there's a group of women protesting in front of the White House in 1917 for women's rights, because remember, women did not have the right to vote in 1917. That didn't come until women's suffrage in 1920. In the center, you can see the 1963 Civil Rights March for Jobs in Washington. The Civil Rights March, that's the one where Martin Luther King shared his I Have a Dream speech. This particular photo, some of you may notice, the guy on the left is Bayard Rustin, who was an openly gay man that helped supported the civil rights movement that we've talked about as an important person in LGBTQ history. 1966, there were farm worker rights protests. You can see the sign there. And then 1968, you can see the sign Gay is Good. The guy holding that sign is Frank Kameny. And LGBTQ people started protesting in 1968 in front of the White House and in various places as well. So those are just some examples. So, and then there's these signs in history I wanted to share with you. So imagine if you were Japanese and you saw a sign like that in the upper right-hand corner, or if you were Mexican or Spanish and you saw that sign in the bottom left-hand corner, or you were German and saw signs like that about Jews in the 40s, or if you lived in the 60s or 70s and saw signs like no gays allowed and you were gay. in the bottom right-hand corner is my friend Glenn, who is Japanese. I went to school with him at UC Riverside, Lily, you'll appreciate that. Anyway, and recently he went to Japanese internment camps because his grandparents were interned as Japanese Americans. And he went in this museum and turned the corner and saw this photo. And in that photo was his grandfather, which he'd never seen before. And when he shared that with me, I asked him, I said, how do you feel about that? He says, it still hurts. I still hurt for my grandparents that went through that. And it didn't hit me until I had him, my friend, say to me, it still hurts because I'm Japanese. So these signs and these things impact all of us as we think about important dates and places in history. So I still ask you the same question, you know, what would it take for you to attend a protest or stand up to march? Would you stand up if there were impacted people living in a different country, if there were impacted people living in a different state, if it impacted a friend, if it impacted a family member? If it impacted you, would you stand up then? What about if you were arrested for dressing a certain way and your name ended up in the newspaper, would you stand up then? What if you had to meet certain social norms in order to rent an apartment, certain requirements? Would you stand up then? What if you couldn't work in certain careers and you couldn't meet your friends in a public place or in a park? Of course, during the pandemic, we all have that challenge. But or what if you could not go drinking or to a restaurant with your friends or be in a certain place because other people? Would you stand up then? Would you do much? So it's important to know that in New York City in the 1960s, that it was illegal for gay and lesbian people to meet in parks, that people were harassed because they were dressed differently. Men who were arrested, names were published in the newspaper. The police took it up on their responsibility, as others did, to call businesses where people were working to say, did you know? And that sort of thing. It's also important to know that in New York during that time in the 60s, the late 60s, there were a variety of different types of bars. There were bars for business people, less affluent people, and that sort of thing. And the Stonewall Inn was a bar, and it was a bar that less affluent people attended. And it's also interesting to note that there were LGBTQ people who were around during the Stonewall riots who lived in New York and went to some of those bars, but they didn't really hear about the Stonewall until months later, which is true in, you know, many events in history. Of course, wars are a little bit different, but the things leading up the Stonewall riots or uprising or whatever we're going to call it, that it was just another day for most people, even if you're gay or lesbian. So, so what I'm going to call it the Stonewall Uprising. Different historians call it different terms, but it's an important event in LGBTQ history. And I put the date and the time early in the morning on June 28th is when the Stonewall Rebellion or Uprising began. Remember, this was not the beginning of the LGBTQ rights movement. And some of the videos that are out there talk about it being the beginning. It was not the beginning, because prior to that, there were all these other events. And on this slide, I've hyperlinked to different articles that you can go and read to better understand these different topics. But remember, World War II was a time that caused men to be together in confined quarters in different places other than the United States. And women were all together in factories for the first time in a way that they hadn't been before. That caused different feelings to develop in many people at that time. The 50s was the Lavender Scare. This executive order 10450 had a lot of impact on LGBTQ people, happened in 1953. And then the Mattachine Society was founded in 1950. The Daughters of Bilitis, 1955. Note that those were both founded in California, one in LA and one in San Francisco. There were those protests in front of the White House. I showed you a little bit of glimpse of those photos earlier. There were also ongoing protests in Philadelphia on the 4th of July for a number of years. And then there were guys that held sit-ins in New York because it was illegal to serve gay and lesbian people. So there were gay people who intentionally got bars, one bar in particular, to arrest them so that they could file a lawsuit to help overturn that. Not unlike the lunch counter stories that we hear of the civil rights movement. So all of those things happened before Stonewall ever happened. So it's important to understand that history. So I wanted to give you that background before we do this activity that you're all going to get to be involved in. So I'm going to go to this other slide. Yeah. So now it's really important that you're on that agenda. And in fact, I'm going to click on this here to show you this agenda so you see what you're going to do next.
Give me one, Rob, I have one person I need to add on real quick.
Add on to what?
Never mind.
Okay.
I was thinking the list of people for a breakout room, but
yeah, no, I'll take care of the breakouts in just a minute.
okay.
Anyway, on the agenda that you have, I'm going to break you into groups, and let's see, I've got like 12 people, so I think I'll break you into 4 groups. So you'll be in groups of 3 or 4. So I'm going to assign you. So I found these short little expert testimonies of people talking about Stonewall. And they're, none of them are longer than 5 minutes. Well, some of them are a little bit longer, but once you get into your groups, you're going to have 10 minutes. So you're going to, did I say 10 minutes or 15 did I give you? 10 minutes, yeah. So what you're going to do with your group, and you can either do this as, I think, if there's somebody in your group that knows how to share your screen and have everybody listen, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, I would expect that everybody's going to click on this sound here and listen to it for 5 minutes. So you're going to do that off the agenda. So you're going to listen to that as a group. Make sure that when you get into your groups, you have a timekeeper and a facilitator. And then there are 4 questions that you're answering. Who was this person? Was this person involved before, during, or after Stonewall? How is this person involved in Stonewall? And what did they do to help the LGBTQ rights movement? So in your group, you're going to have 5 minutes to listen and 5 minutes to discuss those questions.
Be quiet.
Hopefully one of you will take those notes and do that. And then I'll invite you to come back to the main group. Now I'm going to stop sharing here for a minute so I can see you and let you know that I think I'm going to, so I'm just going to say for the recording that I'm going to pause the recording at this point because we're going to break into groups. So welcome back everybody from your breakout rooms. There are some questions that you answered, and the main question I want you to report back on, we'll go person by person based on the ones that you listened to, and overall I'd be interested to hear what did we learn about Stonewall and why is it important is our main question. So I'm going to come back here so I can see all your faces. So let's start with that person 1. Which group, who had person 1 and who'd like to tell us a little bit about that person?
We did. I guess we had a gentleman named Randy and a woman named Marcia, correct? And
Marcia P. Johnson.
P. Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And Randy and Marcia ended up living together. And Marcia was the most one involved, although Randy was involved beforehand. According to him, he and the reporter who was asking the questions, he in 1964 supposedly led the first demonstration, but I would probably say first demonstration in New York City, probably. Then Marcia was a drag queen, transvestite, probably called transgendered today. And she was at Stonewall when the police came in and started throwing everybody out and arresting people and putting them in the paddy wagon. And she was saying that one of the things that when the police made their initial raids before that night, before quote unquote the riot, is that they would go in and steal the money out of the coat room and out of the bar. So they began, when they heard that the police were coming, they would hide all the money. So anyway, she said that no one got hurt in the bar when the police came on that fateful night, but that they had, instead they were injured outside the bar. So.
Great. Anybody else from that group want to add anything?
Yeah, so Marsha P. Johnson was an activist with the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, with Sylvia, is it Sylvia Reyes?
Rivera.
Rivera, sorry, thank you. And Randy Wicker had a different approach. He was more like traditional with his clothing, like suit and tie kind of a guy, and he thought that having that type of respectability would help advance the cause. But then they became roommates in the 70s, and it's interesting how they influenced each other and were both advocates for equality, but in different ways and for different parts of the movement. Randy, being gay, and Marsha P. Johnson for transgender rights.
Great. And you brought up Sylvia Rivera, who's another important person during that time period. Those are both people to check out more about if you'd like to. All right. Group 2 had Craig Rodwell. What can you tell us about Craig? If you could start just quickly who he was, the 4 main questions, if you could just answer those. Who was he? How was he involved before, during, or after? And if he was involved in Stonewall, and then what he did to help the movement.
I can start with that.
Great.
So Craig Wadwell, he began his activism in 1965. So this was before Stonewall, a few years before, and his main priority was visibility within the movement. He talked a lot about his experiences with policing in his community, just being out in the street of other people in his community and experiencing what it felt like to have to change and alter behavior while publicly out in the world. And he also opened the first gay bookstore in 1967 in the entire United States. And he, after Stonewall, helped start the Gay Pride March. And when it came to the Stonewall event itself, we read a little bit further than the designated audio portion, but we learned that he was walking past the event itself and wanted to throw things or participate, but did not to the extent that we read. So that was Craig.
And did you say how he was involved with Stonewall?
After, we didn't get to the part in the audio where it talked about during the event so much, but before, he had a gay bookstore that he opened up in 1967, and then after, he helped with starting the Gay Pride March to commemorate the event, but during, there was not too much information provided for that.
Yeah, but he had a gathering place where those people all gathered afterwards and talked about it also. So just to add that in. So that bookstore was really important in this communication piece. So great. All right, person 3 was Kay Lahusen and Barbara Giddings, group 3. Who were they? How were they involved? How'd they help the movement?
I'll get started.
Great.
So first, I don't think we actually got to the part where they were talking about Stonewall itself. They were talking about this GLF meeting that they were attending, and they were kind of going back and forth about kind of their involvement in this meeting. They have been to a lot of meetings in the past, and there was a point where, and I believe it was probably right after Stonewall, what they were referring to, they were talking about how some people didn't think that they were aggressive enough. They weren't, they didn't fit the norm of like the protesters. They didn't dress the way that some of the people at the meeting thought that they should dress if they were going to fight for gay rights, that kind of thing. So, I mean, what?
Anything else from that group 3, that you want to add?
Yeah, they were questioning their credentials, trying to find out who they were. At least Barbara was from Philadelphia. Let's see what else.
And what group did they belong to? Do any of you recall?
Yeah, Barbara Giddings formed the New York City chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis, if I'm saying that correctly.
Bilitis. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I know during the 60s, before Stonewall, she would organize protests against the federal government for because they were not hiring people of the LGBTQ community and firing them as well.
Great. Anything else about those two women that anybody picked up? Great. Group 4 was Dick Leitch. Who'd like to share from that group? Who was he? How was he involved? How did he help the movement?
I can start us off. So he was the president of the Mattachine Society, which was a gay rights organization, and also came out with the Mattachine Review, which was like the first LGBTQ magazine. So what we listened to was interesting because it was by a journalist, and he meets him later on. He's got these letters from President Obama thanking him for everything he did, which is amazing. For Stonewall, we said that he had been raising awareness to these issues for a while before, and then he's also, I think, the first journalist to report on it.
Anything else anybody wants to add about that?
So what he did, besides being a journalist and raising awareness, is that he organized sip-ins to raise awareness of the treatment of gays in bars. I mean, they couldn't just get together and have a drink. They would go, the police would come, harass them, criminalize them. So he organized the first sip-in, which was based on the sit-ins of the African-American community just a few years prior. And so he started his stuff. The first sip-in was 3 years before Stonewall. And then he continued to be an activist and journalist reporting out for years afterward. And he died in 1980? No, just a couple years ago.
A couple years ago. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So based on that, what new information did you pick up about Stonewall that you didn't know before? Or as you think about all these pieces together, what are the key pieces to remember about Stonewall? Go ahead, Laura. Anybody can jump in.
Well, it was not the very first event or occurrence of folks trying to be treated as humans and have their human rights.
I would add that there's kind of a wide range of organizations and groups that were going to be affected and involved in it. It's not like it was just one community within even the LGBTQ community that's going to kind of have it be something that affects them. It wasn't just like one small group of folks. It was sort of broad.
Yeah, good point. Somebody else?
I do. I like the fact that there's all these people who got involved to different degrees. And I think you were saying earlier about what would it take for you to stand up for someone or to fight for something. And I think it's cool to show for our students that there are people who supported by being in the middle of it, and then there's people who supported by doing what they do best, and maybe that was journalism or whatever else.
So I'm gonna call on Rick and ask Rick. So
yes,
you know, Rick's gay like I am. So I'm curious, Rick, growing up as a gay man, what you knew about Stonewall and why Stonewall is important to you.
I mean, Stonewall is important to me for a lot of reasons. But I also want to address your earlier question around, you know, with all of these different narratives that we're hearing about previous things that happened to Stonewall. And I think the importance of that for me is that it really, as a gay man, hearing about Stonewall being the moment, right? The watershed moment when everything happened and gay rights fell from the heavens to be fought for by us here was not how it happened. That there was a lot of infrastructure building, that there was a lot of built up thought through things that happened before, that it wasn't just this event that appeared out of nowhere. Right. Yes, there was a lot of pressure. Yes, there was a lot of things, but there were a lot of communities, a lot of people, a lot of individuals before that built up the building blocks to not just create this moment in this particular time, but also the tools and the language to address it in a way that the rest of the public could understand what was happening. Right. And I think that's essential, because at least for me, growing up hearing the story, the mythology really of Stonewall, it always felt like, okay, like this was the point where something terrible happened to our community, and we did this reactionary fight back kind of punch, right? And that's not really what it was. And so I think that's essential for not just me to understand, but for everybody to understand, that all of these things came to, and it wasn't even a boiling point, right? It was the natural conclusion of where this this progressive movement was headed, right? This particular thing got a lot of attention for a lot of places. And here, let me share a little part of the mythology that had been talked about in the past when I was learning about Stonewall, which is, and I think this is funny. I think that there is also a place for it, but I think that its importance was highlighted in a way before, that now that we have these narratives more out in the open, that it is less important. And so part of what the impetus that some historians in the past had put for Stonewall was that the death of Judy Garland had happened a few weeks, maybe a few days prior to the riot, the uprising. And some had posited that grief over this lost icon is what the right, and you're laughing, but this is the story we heard, right?
I know, we've all heard that story, yeah.
Right, that the grief over this lost icon is what pushed the gay community over the edge, which of course, you know, reinforces that stereotype about who we are, how we define ourselves, what the viability of our civil rights actually are, right? And it's a fun story, but it really does have that underlying message to it. You put all of these other narratives that we just heard, and it comes apart, right? Judy Garland, sure, maybe it had a thing to it, but it was not as important as people thought. We had sit-ins, we had libraries, we had bookstores, we had people gathering beforehand, we had all of the things that were happening in California, from Compton's Cafeteria, Cooper's Donuts, the Black Cat Cafe or Black Cat Bar in San Francisco, the Black Cat Cafe in Los Angeles, right? All of these things led up to this point. And for the reason of, I guess, visibility, the fact that it was such a larger crowd at this point, this got the attention. So yeah, was that what you were asking, Rob?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to hear, you know, can you recall when you were growing up, when you first heard about Stonewall?
Oh boy. You know, I'm a 90s kid. I was a teenager in the 90s, and I knew about the Pride parades at the time, but I really didn't know about Stonewall until I really looked into it.
So your own research
college.
Then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was well into my late teens by the time I knew what it was about.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to my slides just to, oh, that's not my slide, sorry. So that activity, you can use that in a variety of different ways. So you've got all those recordings. There's other people for groups of 6. You could break people into groups like that. You could have it read them on their own. There's a separate handout there that I put together in case you want to use that. You could have students make copies of that and fill it in. So there's lots of ways that you could explore this with your students. I would suggest that in every rights movement, there are important dates and moments. And so Stonewall was one of those dates that most gay people know about, whether they were around at the time or they heard it in the history books later, right? And in most of our US history books, there's always been at least some mention of Stonewall, even if there's nothing else. So that's why that's important. So here's what I would suggest that you, why does
Rob, we can't see you, hon.
I know, I just realized that. I don't know why all of a sudden my computer is deciding when I share and when I stop sharing. But anyway, let me go back. Come on. All right, we talked about that, why it's important. There we go. Okay. So here's what I would recommend you focus on. That it happened in 1969. It was at an inn, a bar, and some called it a riot, some called it an uprising, some called it a rebellion. Students could, read lots of different articles to decide what they would want to call it. It was all of those in different ways. You heard Rick kind of explain why it was that. No one really knows who started it or threw the first brick, kind of like the shot heard round the world of the Revolutionary War, right? Nobody really knows, because at the time, nobody knew that it was going to be an important moment in history. All the people who were there were just tired of being harassed. And, they've been protesting and frustrated by their treatment. And it was just the last straw for several people. And then it continued on for several days. And so that's the important part to remember as part of this, is to put it in the context of other history. The 60s was a big protest decade for lots of protests. And you heard about the sip-in, similar to the sit-ins. All of those things were going on at the same time. But that's the Stonewall. Lots of different things you could dive into in lots of different ways. So I always thought Stonewall was important. And as you've heard me say before, I came out later in life and learned about the history of Stonewall, but I wanted to go to Stonewall. So I've been there twice now, and in fact, was there last February. You can see me on the far left there with my friend Ron, and the guy there his name is Tree, and he's the bartender there. Now he'll tell you that he was there on the night of the Stonewall Uprising, that he was working that night. But the interesting part was, after going to this bar during the day, then I met up with Eric Marcus, who you heard his some of his podcasts in here, and he says, yeah, Tree says that, but he really wasn't there working. He was not working at the bar during that time, but Tree will tell other people that he was working at the bar at the time. So, but that's part of the mystique and the fun of the Stonewall, right? Of that, as many events in history, right? So you can see that's what the bar looks like. It's pretty small. It's not that big, but I felt like I really wanted to go, just because, to me, reading about the history, I thought this was a crucial moment in history. And perhaps those of you are history teachers like I am, it's fun to go to those places. Like, if you teach the Civil War, it's interesting to go to the actual Battle of Gettysburg and go there. So this was that experience for me, the LGBT history piece, and to know the people stood up at that moment for their rights, even though they didn't realize it at the time. You can see a picture of the Stonewall on the right, and then across the street from the Stonewall is this park where you see these statues. Now, the guy who did these sculptures, supposedly the same sculptures, is at Stanford University. Now, I haven't gone there to see the sculptures there, but that's what the little description says there. The other interesting thing I wondered for myself was, how was it that this riot or this gathering of people could go on for days? And when you look at where it's located, there's all these streets that come together in New York there. So there were many ways. I mean, the police could try to block the streets off, but there's like 5 different streets that come into that area, and lots of back streets. And of course, the people that lived in Greenwich Village knew the back streets. And so, police would try to kick people out one way, they'd go around and come back and be part of the crowd another way. So, which is often the way protests happen and that sort of thing. But so it was interesting to me that the fact that the location of the Stonewall was also in a location that was easy for people to get to by foot, because that's how most people got to it. Anyway, so that was my experience with Stonewall actually being there. It is fun to visit and just have a drink there, just as it's fun to visit other places. And if you happen to run into Tree, he's got lots of stories. Some of them have been added on to over the years, and some of them might actually be true, but hey, that's what history is all about, right? So the other piece to focus on is there were lots of organizations that grew from the event. You heard Barbara Giddings and Kay Lewhausen talk about the GLF, or the Gay Liberation Front. That organization grew out of Stonewall, and it was a Greenwich Village organization that then put on the Christopher Street Parade in 1970, which was a commemoration. Just think about it for a minute. If those people didn't come together to say, we should commemorate this, then we would not have pride the way we do today. So it's important to point out to lots of people that key people came together to mark important events in their lives, right? Just like we all do in our families. There's important dates and events in our families. Perhaps some of us celebrate Mother's Day or things like that. But there was a group of people in Greenwich Village who thought it was important to commemorate that. And you heard some of them who made sure that the day was marked and that they got the permits. And then that pride led on to all these other prides. And so know that in 70 and 71, there were big prides or the beginning of prides in LA, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and London that they continued on. But I also want to point out that locally, we had a Santa Cruz Pride in 75, which was the third one in California. So many cities' prides grew from that. And that just causes me to segue into the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, Queer Santa Cruz exhibit that is online here. And I just wanted to show you the one section of it that talks about pride. So here are the real people in Santa Cruz who took place in Pride in 1975, just like the real people in New York who gathered the other groups together. And you can read quotes from people who were there. This quote I especially like, Pat Dallin says, you know, in 75, there were 200 people who came together in San Lorenzo Park to come out for the very first gay pride in Santa Cruz. This was the first time that LGBTQ people in Santa Cruz publicly came out, which led to other events and that sort of thing. And you can scroll down and read the other parts and see the rest of the exhibits here and share it with your students. And I can tell you that it's a very student-friendly exhibit because I helped write a lot of the narration that goes with this based on the knowledge that I've learned around Santa Cruz as well. But the important part of Pride and other pieces is that it happened in every community in a variety of ways, and it continues to happen today. So that's how you can bring it forward if you want to for that. So I just want to remind you as we think about, as I talked about before, there are these different social movements, and this is just one social movement in history, so you can put it in that context as you talk about it. And the Stonewall Uprising, there's a lot to talk about there. In one of those audios that you listened to, they talked about how a year ago in June, the New York police apologized for their actions at Stonewall, a public apology that did that more. And so there's lots of different pieces there. Each one of these links is on that lesson plan that I put together for you that you can see as well. So I think I'm gonna point out that we have the Fair Education Act. We've talked about that before. And this is one piece of that history that you can talk about. As you talk about thinking about what people are included and the people that are excluded and what people do when they don't feel like they're included. This is just one example in history. So with that, I'm gonna stop and take any questions or other comments from any of you. Feel free to grab the microphone or type anything in the chat.
I don't know if you saw the message I just put in the chat, but Brittany was on earlier and her school district just did a textbook adoption, and today is actually the training for the US history textbook. And she texted me a picture, and it says Fair Act, and then it's one sentence, right? So, and I know that the textbooks of the one that her district chose was one of the, looking at the Fair Act and making sure there was something in there about it was a priority for the district. So the textbook that was chosen was one of the better ones, but it still was lackluster. So if we know anything, we need to make sure that we're taking things from the work that like Rob does and putting it into our curriculum, integrating it or inclusively in there, because there's really not enough in the textbooks. I just wanted to share that she was in here and she texted me. She's like, "This is way different than what you're doing." I'm like, "Yeah." So.
Great. Other comments? Thoughts?
I had a question. As I'm teaching the civil rights movement, I want to obviously hone in on the voices of each movement, but also mention key allies throughout, so that my students can see that, like, what does it take to stand up? It doesn't take necessarily being a part of, you can just have empathy. Anyway, so can you think of were there any strong allies that stick out to you around Stonewall or the early LGBTQ movement?
So the interesting part of Stonewall, the experts will say to you, these people were there, but no one person was like, the leader. It's not like we can say Martin Luther King gave the "I Have a Dream" speech at Stonewall, right? There is not that one person. It was all those combinations of people. But I know you have that curriculum guide, and if you look at the back section where it talks about the textbook selection criteria, there's a whole list of people there. But you heard people mention those people who are listed there for the recordings. There's some key people, but certainly Frank Kameny was another person that, but he lived in Washington, D.C., not necessarily New York. But those people that are in the recordings were there, are some of the key people there. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, those two people have been there. One of the links in the agenda links you to all the Making Gay History podcasts that Eric Marcus did during Stonewall 50, which was a year ago, and any of those people were important as well. Rick, is there anybody else that stands out to you?
Well, I mean, if the question is about non-queer people who are allies to the movement, the only one that I can think of right now did it for financial reasons. And so that is the 1951 Black Cat Bar in San Francisco. It was Stuman versus Riley. That was the name of the court case. And the owner of the bar was being charged with having an indecent, an indecent public space because homosexuals were increasingly gathering there. So he went to court and said, there's no law, there shouldn't be any law about people just coming together in space. And so I know you're asking for like an ally who like believes in LGBTQ equality, all that kind of stuff. But this is like a financial reason that a straight person supported gay rights because it affected his bottom line.
Okay.
Yeah, there really aren't specific allies, but Jennifer put some of the people's names from the framework that are listed there. And each one of them have their own stories. I think that's probably the important part. I don't know any allies necessarily. Because remember, the culture at the time really didn't allow that. And people were only standing up for other people privately, which is why I started with those questions. What would cause you to stand up? So I think that's our best answer. If you discover any, let us know.
Will do. And then sorry, I have another question.
Sure.
I was just wondering, I know that when the Americans went into the concentration camps and freed most of the people, that many of the LGBTQ prisoners remained, I don't know if it's in the camp or just in prison. How does that story end? Do you know, like, at what point do they get out? Do many of them spend the rest of their lives in prison? What's the...
You mean for the concentration camps?
Yeah.
Yeah, they eventually get released. Where they went is not really well documented. There's only one or two people who actually wrote that story down. So, and one of the stories is called The Pink Triangle. That was the only other person. I forget the author of that, but I don't know that anybody really knows. The people who would know best probably are people at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., if there are any other stories along those lines.
Okay.
I want to point out in the chat, Karen said that Elizabeth Taylor was an ally. Can you talk more about that, Karen?
Well, I think we could say there were lots of Hollywood allies in different time periods, but none of them were out allies. It's not like they would stand up in a newspaper and say, yes, I'm gay. Yes, I support gay people, until later. Yeah. As somebody asked about music in the LGBT LGBTQ rights movement. Lauren asked that. So if you look at, again, if you've got my curriculum guide, if you look at the Harlem Renaissance, there's a lot of singers there. That's also listed. I can put the link in the chat room for that. Other singers from Harlem Renaissance. There was also, and I'm learning this more around Santa Cruz County, that there was a group of women. Women's music was really important in the lesbian rights movement, much different than the gay men's rights movement. And one of Eric Marcus's podcasts, I forget the woman, sang lots of folk songs, and she went around singing these folk songs about being lesbian and people loving each other and things like that. So just know that if you Google lesbian women's music or women's music festival, you'll find them. It's interesting to note that the first women's music festival actually took place in the Santa Cruz Mountains in the early 1970s, and that there is a whole body of lesbian music if you want to research that direction. So, yeah.
Right.
For some of you may know the name Holly Near, so that's one of the singers. Go ahead, Rick.
Oh, I also wanted to say, since it is contemporary, quote unquote, you also might want to look into some of the works of Little Richard. One of my favorite stories about Little Richard is if you look at the lyrics of Tutti Frutti, that literally is a song in its original form to talk about gay male sex. And sex with people who cross-dressed. And so the interpretation of it is, if you listen to the lyrics, even without any of the specific references, all of the names of the feminine names that are in the song, it has been pointed out, were all common drag names at the day and period that it was being played. So it was one of the ways that queer culture, queer Black culture to be very specific, was co-opted by, well, not co-opted, but was released into the mainstream in ways that were subversive, that the people that were consuming the media didn't know that it was part of queer culture.
Karen, do you want to read what you wrote in the chat room? Or do you want me to read it? Karen, if you're talking, we can't hear you. I'm not sure if you want to.
Yes, there you go.
Oh, good. Yes.
Yeah, I had turned it down because my puppies were becoming restless.
Yeah. No, please share that information. That's pretty interesting. And yeah, go ahead.
Judy, who is mentioned here in this article, I knew of her. She and her business partner started a record company in the 70s. It was a lesbian record company.
How do you say her last name?
I always have one. Dulugacz.
Okay, like so it's spelled D-L-U-G-A-C-Z, just for those of you who are listening. Go ahead. So tell us about Judy.
Judy is one of the owners of Olivia Travel, and I travel with them all the time. It's a lesbian travel company. And she began her business career by creating a music company that specialized in lesbian performers. The first person I ever was introduced to is Chris Williamson, and these women here are always invited to the Olivia Cruises, lesbian. So as you read here that 1973 is when she created her record company. So going back to 1973, we have a record industry. She's now gone into the travel industry. She no longer has the record industry. And she's also looking at getting into retirement homes for lesbian women so they can live together and feel safe in a retirement community. Basically in Florida for that one, I think. So anyway.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to make sure we got it for the recording, that the fact that Judy was important, that she produced 40 albums and sold more than 1 million records for artists such as Chris Williamson, Meg Christian, Teresa Troll, and Linda Tillery, because somebody asked about music and LGBT history. And Chris Williamson and Holly Near often were would be singing together, as I've learned from talking to
Mhm.
people around Santa Cruz.
And then, of course, Melissa Etheridge.
Right. So all those people.
Mm-hmm.
I
Great.
just saw this article this morning about Rosetta Tharpe. They said, never forget, rock and roll was invented by a queer Black woman. So I put the link in the chat there too. And I listened to an excerpt of her song or a clip. And it really was before her time. Like this was like in the 1930s where she started playing. And they said she influenced people like Elvis Presley and oh gosh, there's another like big rock and roll guy. It's in the article I linked there.
Yeah, so I think what we know, especially in the arts, that LGBTQ people gravitated towards the arts and did wonderful things with music and performances, and those are certainly other areas to explore, right? Hollywood or the Hays Codes or things like that. But today we really wanted just to touch about Stonewall so that you had some frame of reference in the hope that you would at sometime either this week or next week go out and do something with it. So that's my encouragement to all of you is hopefully that you'll do something with this sometime in the next weeks, and then that you'll come back next week to share how that went. So like I said earlier, whether you are share it with a colleague, whether you share it with your family, whether you share it with a group of students, it would be great to do something as far as a lesson, something with somebody over the next week, and then report it back to us next week. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording and thank everybody for being here. And I look forward to seeing everybody here